Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, coming to you again from San Francisco. We're at the Momentum Conference of the Tides Foundation. And joining us now is John Powell, Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
A few years ago, a storm hit New Orleans. And during that period of Katrina, there was a fascinating, almost rip in the fabric of American culture when it comes to mass media. We actually discovered there actually is something called race and class in America. And you had this conversation taking place on television and everywhere. And we saw images that most people don't see every day. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, that discussion, that window closed. Race and class in America kind of disappeared to the margins again. And now we've elected an African-American president, so I guess there's no problem anymore. What does your research tell you about the real conditions in American cities?
Well, American cities are extremely racialized, especially older cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, less so of cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Phoenix. But even basically what you have is cities are very racialized, meaning that people of color are much more likely to settle in cities, and opportunities that allow people to have a good life have moved away from those racialized cities. You can tell if a city is racialized if it has an inner city. There's no inner city in in San Francisco or Seattle. But when we talk about Detroit and Cleveland, we talk about the inner city.
So what creates these inner cities and why does it matter?
Well, basically it's a confluence of things, starting really with the 1930s and government policies. In the 1930s, Americans in urbanized areas lived in the city. Essentially, there were no suburbs. A few wealthy people lived in the suburbs, and we then called them bedroom communities because that's where people slept, and they got up in the morning and went to work in the city. And then something happened. Well, first of all, you had a large influx of African Americans and other people of color into urbanized areas, and you also had a demand for ending of formal racial segregation and isolation. At the same time you had that demand, you had the explosion of suburbs. The modern suburbs became formed, really built by the federal government with support from local and state government. And those new structures, those new suburbs, were really built for white people, explicitly. There was nothing subtle about it. So you had a new kind of segregation, even while you had a new kind of demand for inclusion. And the result of that is what we live with today. And most people think it's just a matter of public choice or private choice. People want to live in the suburbs. They don't understand why those suburbs were constructed. And interestingly enough, it's not just the construction of suburbs and the distribution of opportunity. It's actually the creation of modern white America, which did not exist before the 1930s.
So why was this policy undertaken so consciously? Why the creation of white suburbs?
Part of it was just basically, you have to remember in the 1930s, America was still in a place of explicit white supremacy. That was the official position of the country. It was a little embarrassing to have that position and be fighting Germany in World War II and have 1 million black soldiers participate. But that was America, that's our history. And so, like a lot of things, we went forward with a lot of contradictions. So the federal government leaned and weighed in on racial inclusion, and at the same time, it was designed to accommodate this continuing white supremacy. So the two sort of collided. And so now we have formal, informal racial exclusion and the end of formal racial exclusion.
Well, you wouldn't know this if you looked at American media, as they say, except for that 2 or 3 weeks around Katrina. But, and even to some extent during the election campaign, there was an interesting controversy between then candidate Obama and Reverend Wright.
Right.
And while a lot has been made of the race speech, one of the important things about Obama's race speech is he seemed to actually be arguing against the idea of structural racism. There's a bit of old thinking. And there's generally maybe a feeling in the country, especially now that there's a black president, and certainly it's an achievement for America to elect a black president, but the feeling that we moved on. So what does it really mean to have these impoverished inner cities in terms of opportunity in people's lives?
Well, it's actually, it really is a heavy weight on people's lives. I sometimes talk about people needing to run up or down escalator. And when you have opportunity, you're an escalator and the escalator is moving you to opportunity. when you have lack of opportunity, you're on the escalator and the escalator is moving you away from opportunity. Doesn't mean you won't get there, it just means it's a lot more work. And in some ways, President Obama, certainly in his speech at the NAACP, he sort of acknowledged the structural racialization that exists in America. The problem is there's not any structural policies to move us away from that. So America, because America is sort of in love with the heroic, self-contained, isolated individual, John Wayne, believes that everything can be done by the individual. And so when we talk about race in the United States and race relations, we make it an interpersonal relationship as opposed to a set of relationships that are mediated through institutions, through highways, through schools, through jobs. And so instead of fixing those institutions that do a lot of the work of sorting out our lives, we talk about whether or not we like each other.
Well, give us some hard numbers. What are some of the comparative statistics? If you're born in a white suburb, you're born in an inner city, what are the different choices or opportunities? How does it differ?
I'll give you two examples. There's a recent study that came out of Harvard that basically looks at 4 different indicators of people living in high concentrated poverty. And it says living in high concentrated poverty, living in a certain type of household, having a certain type of job. That children born in those situations lose 1 year of educational attainment and 4 IQ points in the first 5 or 6 years of their lives. And they essentially never make it up. Now, who are those children? Something like 96% of those children are African American. So you can describe this in terms of, well, this is just poverty. No. Poor whites don't live. Poor urban whites are 6 or 7 times less likely to live in deep, concentrated poverty, which means where opportunity is not. Let me give you another example. I recently moved to Columbus, Ohio with my family. My daughter went to a school there where when she graduated from high school, her class, 100% of her class graduated. 100% went to college. In Detroit, 25%, less than 25% of the students in that school system graduated from high school. If you're an African American boy, less than 20% graduated from high school. So if nothing else, you put a child in a school system in Detroit, it's an 80% chance, almost 80% chance they will not finish high school.
President Obama spent a lot of time talking about personal responsibility. In fact, he's talked more about personal responsibility in the African American community than I think he's talked about structural racism in the society. Well, what do you make of that?
Well, it's hard to say, but basically, it plays well in America. The idea of that we're all responsible for our own lives. None of us are only responsible for our own lives. Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Outlier, he talks about that if you look at any success story, and there's a whole network behind that success story, whether you're talking about Bill Gates or whether you're talking about Gordie Howe. And what we do in America is that, and especially what I would call the new racial discourse, is to believe that every individual stands and falls on his or own. And yet, as I suggested, if you go to the school system where I live, it's going to be very hard to fall. If you go to a school system in Detroit, it's going to be very hard to succeed.
No, but you don't understand, obviously. People chose to be born in poverty. They had, they got offered the suburb, they got offered the poverty, and obviously they must have chosen to live in poverty.
Except, as you know, that especially when the suburbs were set up, explicitly written into the underwriting codes, it was clear that the suburbs were for white people. And we spent billions and billions and billions of dollars of constructing a new set of opportunities, new schools, new highways, new shopping centers, tax breaks, housing breaks, all this for a new white America.
In other words, not through someone's great individual choice,
no, not at all.
As a structural...
Right, and it exploded the white middle class. Before, in the 1930s, the white middle class was anemic. The white middle class was actually something that the federal government invested in and created the structure for them to live in and excluded people of color. That's never been changed. That's never been changed. When George Romney became the Secretary of Housing under Nixon, he said the only way to really address this problem is to open up the suburbs. Now, it's not really the suburbs versus the city that's the issue. It's the question of how we structure the geography of opportunity in America. And right now it is largely city and suburbs, but also older suburbs.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about what you think the solutions are and why these solutions aren't already policy. So please join us for the next segment of our interview with John Powell on the Real News Network.